Well, welcome. As always, it's always fun to read the paper or listen to what's happening in Washington until you realize it's real serious. This is not comic relief that we're looking for. But today, we're going to talk about a group that works, the Massachusetts government. At least works compared to everywhere else we see. So why don't we start with an introduction?
Al, nice to be here. Thank you for having me. I think this is my second show now since I've gotten sworn in as state representative.
Now, we're the Worcester 10th?
Yes, 10th Worcester District, that's right.
Because people have asked, saying, what does that mean?
Well, there's all different districts, obviously, Norfolk, Middlesex, Worcester, and, Milford, Hopedale, Mendon, and Precinct 1 of Medway are designated as the 10th Worcester District.
I'd like to trade a street.
Okay.
I don't care what street. Because the way I look at it is Medway gets 2 representatives by trading a couple streets off.
Yeah, probably. That's right.
John
That's
used to say,
Yeah.
I can't advocate for part of Medway.
No.
So you got 2 representatives. It's like, okay, can we trade a street with them so we get 2?
I know. It's and I've met a lot of nice people from Medway, and have gotten some good correspondence and communication with them. And on any issue over there, I work with Representative Jeffrey Roy and also Senator Karen Spilka.
So now 6 months in, was it what you expected?
I don't know if I know what I expected. Things came on very fast, very early, because once you got sworn in, you had these deadlines of filing bills and responding to certain things, which were very, very quick, all in January. Concurrent with that process, of course, you've got a lot of folks who are interested in these bills, as well as lobbyists, advocacy groups, really contacting you very strongly about positions on certain bills. There was over 6,000 bills, so close to 6,000 bills that were filed. And it's impossible to try to know all of them in a degree of depth, but you try to focus on bills that you think help your area, and then also that groups or constituents bring to your attention. So that was quite a very busy January, February.
6,000 different bills.
Yeah, there was roughly, I think it was 5,700 that originally got filed, and then of course there were subsequent bills after that, but it's close to 6,000 bills.
So Brian, how do you even start? I mean, if you were in the U.S. Congress, you could say there's certain bills that affect the square states that don't affect us.
Yeah.
But we've got 90 miles.
We tried to, myself and my aide, because as reps and senators filed their bills, they would shoot an email out and say, these are my 5 or 10 bills that I'm filing, please look them over if there's anything you'd like to co-sponsor. So we went through as much of that as we could, and I think I don't know that we hit all of it, but we hit a very large portion of it to see which ones we thought would be helpful, and signed on as co-sponsors. I think I signed on to, my aide gave me the number last week, and it might have been about 300 plus bills. Some had signed on to more and some have signed on to less, but I thought that was, an appropriate number, I guess, as you viewed the content and things that would be, most meaningful to us.
Well, some of them I saw, the bill for the fellow in Blackstone Valley, just felt like a good thing.
Well, that was a late file, so that was something that was done in April. It was brought to my attention by Dr. Fitzpatrick at Blackstone Valley Tech, and the individual involved recently had gotten diagnosed with a ALS disease, and unfortunately was about 120 days shy of having 10 years into the retirement system. So, a disease like that is just so devastating.
It's a spiral to nowhere good.
It's very devastating, physically, emotionally, and financially to the family. So, what I did was I filed a bill to provide the days of service that the individual needed He'd have to make the contribution, you know, that he would otherwise make to get him to the 10 years. Because but for the disease, clearly,
He would have been there.
Clearly, he would have, you know, worked another 110 days and made the 10 years. So we filed that. House counsel was very, very helpful in terms of educating me on a particular bill like that and the process that we needed to go through. I then contacted Senator Fatman's office because we needed to work together on that. He was very, very supportive and did everything that he could do on the Senate end. And the bill was actually making very good progress considering it had been filed so late. It was on to its second committee, and I had just did a letter actually last week to the chair of that most recent committee to try to move that bill on, and unfortunately, you know, the individual just recently passed, so I'm not real sure where we go for there, but we'll figure it out.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, when you look and you say, there's got to be room in our hearts, in our budgets, in our lives, to take care of somebody like that.
Yeah, it just was so unfair. I mean, that disease is so unfair in and of itself. And you know, he, like I said, he has a family, obviously. I also contacted the Mass Teachers Union, brought them up to speed on the whole situation. You know, they were very supportive and they were ready to, you know, jump in and advocate for it as well. And I told, you know, Mrs. Lamar, the wife, I said, look, this is a learning experience for me. I'm just here and I'm not pretending, I've never done this before, do you know what I mean? This is a late file bill, you know, special legislation, but House counsel is very, very helpful. And I think it does help being an attorney because, you know, we can kind of speak the same language, and we drafted it, you know, very quickly and got it filed very quickly.
But whether or not it went, just the fact that you stood up and said, this just isn't right. It doesn't feel good to have somebody come up short like that.
Oh yeah, and I mean, I think so many people around the community have reached out to the family and have done, you know, what they could do and supported them, and you know, it was the least that I could do.
Now, another bill I saw on your webpage, boy, you got a busy webpage. Somebody's only been there for 6 months.
Yeah.
It looked like you got your hands in a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But there's some confusion. We read on a bill to tax the roads or use of the roads. And immediately people start thinking, okay, so once again, you're going to put a tax on Metro West to pay for North-South Boston. But that's not what you intended,
no,
right?
what I did was, you know, and again, this is working with the Metro West legislators who, you know, their coalition is working to try to restore some sense to the tolling that occurs on the Mass Pike, which, as you know, Central Mass and Western Mass are really the only, you know, other than the one toll coming in off the Tobin Bridge, those are the only tolls in the state. So our district, our area, is really subsidizing the bulk of transportation costs in this state, and it's not fair. So, you know, I talked to a couple of the representatives, and I filed this. There are other bills out there that are filed to try to equalize the tolling so that, you know, if we could establish some sort of system from the north, from the south heading to Boston, then, you know, you can try to reduce the tolls that Central Mass pay. And we're trying to figure out ways to do this. So this was a way to jump into that conversation, really get the issue started, or I shouldn't say started, I mean really bring the issue more to light, start the discussion as to what can be done in terms of toll fairness, because right now, to us in Metro West and Central Mass, it's not fair. So I filed it as kind of like a stark, in your face to other legislators that this is our reality. You know, folks that get up from Milford and get on the Mass Pike and go to work every day face this toll. Your people don't. So you need to see what this looks like on black and white, and, you know, where do we go from there?
So this is not an intent to increase the tax.
No.
It's more to make it more equitable.
It's definitely to make it more equitable, and the ideal would be to lower the tolls that the Central Mass and the Western Mass pay, with, you know, the makeup being on other areas of the state.
You know, and it's funny because the insurance companies figured out a way. Because I
Sure.
no longer, for my 5% discount or low mileage or whatever on one of the cars, I don't have to tell them. Somehow, when I go to have the car inspected, they know exactly how many miles.
Oh, okay, sure, yeah.
So I always wondered
Yeah.
if, you know, a fairway wouldn't be just to say, okay, we're generating $100 worth of revenue. There's 1,000 miles driven a year by, you know, all the vehicles. Okay, it's penny a mile. Doesn't matter where you are. So, I mean, it just seems like,
Yeah, that's another proposal that I think is something like you're describing. That's proposed, you know, that's kind of ruminating out there as well. I think the crux of it is, you know, transportation costs are obviously increasing. Our roads and bridges need a lot of work. So the idea is how do we, you know, get this funding and how do we make it equitable to folks in the Commonwealth? So this is really one piece of that discussion, really tossed out there to try to bring this issue to light and further it along with the Metro West legislators. In fact, we had a meeting on it last week, the Metro West caucus, and the Department of Transportation right now has a proposal that could go forward, that Route 3 corridor down to, well, South Shore and onto the Cape. They have the land to build an extra lane, and the proposal is that that would be an optional toll lane. So that if you wanted to quicken your ride and not deal with the traffic, you could go into that lane for an optional toll. But from what I'm understanding, the administration does not want to go forward on that.
see that,
So-
I saw that work in Washington when I lived there, in LA when I commuted there. You had the option of going like the Dulles Toll Road.
Yes,
You could
Yeah.
go on the regular one
yeah,
and just sit there in gridlock, or you could pay, back then it was $1 or $2 more, and you just flew.
yeah. So I mean, the idea is, you know, there are options out there, and we need to have that discussion. We can't be afraid of that discussion because transportation really fuels the entire state between education, the economy. So that's really, you know, that particular bill, it's really not one of the larger bills, but it's a bill that was filed to really kind of spur that discussion on.
So there's no real intent yet, it's just, hey guys, let's figure out a way of making it more fair.
Yes, and like all bills, I mean, they get put in there, they get shuffled off to different committees, and then there could be a number of bills dealing with the same issue before a particular committee. That committee could you know, consolidate those bills, rewrite, you know, see what comes out, send it off to study. So there's a lot of different options on any type of bill.
Now you're using words like working with. Everything we read, everything we hear about the circus in Washington is blue shall never touch red and vice versa. Doesn't seem that way on Beacon Hill.
It really isn't. It's not anything that I've experienced. You know, some of the nicest people that I've met that have been very helpful to me have been Republicans who are not, you know, part of our delegation, obviously, or our caucus. I think everybody in there wants to try to help each other going forward. You know, I know the press will come out and, you know, I think they try to accentuate party divisions much more than I experience in the House. Everybody has been very, very helpful in terms of, you know, the job going forward, particular bills. Now, that's not to say that you agree on everything and that you could, you know,
Yeah, but you could
sign
say
on
that
to-
amongst the Democrats. I can't
Absolutely.
imagine that
Yeah.
you don't have a far left side versus a moderate side, and they're not going to agree on everything either.
Absolutely, absolutely. But the working relationship is very productive, very healthy. You know, I've worked, you know, with Senator Fatman, who's a Republican, and we've gotten along great, you know, on local issues, on events. You know, we're sharing information. If I find out about something that, you know, I think he needs to be a part of, I'll let him know. I think he's doing that on my end as well. In fact, we just had the Milford girls softball team. But let's give them a shout out. Division I state champions again.
Again.
Good for the girls. So we had them in for a tour of the State House. You know, had a nice pizza lunch for them. Gave them citations, and Senator Fatman was there. His office was a big part of it. So I think it was a nice time for the girls and the coaches.
Well, that whole model of the Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan interactions where you couldn't find somebody who was more diametrically opposed in most of their
Right.
views, but it always seemed they respected each other
Absolutely.
and they could work to get things done.
Yep.
You know, and I think, at least from my point of view, I really don't care if you're blue or red, because I've always had a hard time, as we mentioned at the last show, conservative Democrat from Massachusetts versus a liberal Republican.
Sure.
I mean, people had a hard time figuring out Dick Moore.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were always, you know, accusing him of being Republican, and
Right.
he had to correct them.
Right. Right.
But to me, that model makes me feel good.
Yeah.
You know, because I certainly hope that we never have somebody representing us that spouts dogma. You know, I want this regardless if it's good or not for Milford.
Right.
You know, so things
Yeah.
like helping a family who's 100 days short, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, and coming from the municipal background that, you know, that we've been involved in, you know, I've never been about that. You know, it's always about, you know, this is the job that needs to be done. You know, how are we going to do it? Well, you might think we need to do it that way. You might think we need to do it another way. You know, whatever it is, let's get the ideas on the table and figure out the way to go. So, I mean, that's the background that, you know, that I come from. And, you know, I've worked very well with Senator Fatman, who's very supportive on the budget earmarks that I put in. He fought for them as well in the Senate. We got a couple through in today's world. That's a good thing. So you know, we're forging ahead.
But you know, you turn around and you look, and you say that's the only way you're going to get things done.
I would think so. Sure.
You know, because otherwise, going into the gridlock we see in D.C., how does that help us in Milford?
It doesn't, and I don't think it helps us as a country. It's difficult to imagine how we got here as a country. I don't think it's anything that the framers of the Constitution ever envisioned. Political discourse, compromise, you know, that's the way the democratic process works.
Well, now we look at some of the other bills. I saw that you're looking to help us with ELL.
Yeah, there are a few things on that front. Locally, I think it was a refile of a bill that Representative Fernandes had filed in the past. And basically, it looked to address the influx of ELL students, English language learner students, that would come in during the school year. So, you know, not all the time kids are there on August 31st and ready to start the school year. You know, sometimes kids come in mid-year, which puts a lot of pressure on school systems, particularly when you're talking about specialized programming like ELL, which can be so diverse. It's not just Spanish anymore. It could be, you know, Chinese. It could be Hindu. I mean, I know there's a lot of different diversity and classes of people up at the high school.
You're right, because
now.
when we think about it, gut feeling says we have English, Portuguese, Spanish. Do we have anything else? And then you find out there's like 20 other languages.
It's unbelievable. And that's been a change that we've seen in Milford. I mean, I don't think that we had that diversity when I was on the school committee going back 10, 20 years ago, but it's really changed. So, you know, the bill that Representative Fernandes had put together, which I refiled, basically called for if there was an influx of 20 or more ELL students during that particular school year, the school district would be able to get the corresponding funding amount from the state, sort of like a circuit breaker type thing, so that you could get those extra funds. I don't know if you'd need to hire an aide or maybe a different type of language teacher. Whatever the service might be, at least those funds would be available, so you wouldn't have to wait the following fiscal year. You'd be able to address it in the year that you actually get the influx.
And you know, it's funny because when we got the big influx a couple years ago,
Yes.
you remember you were at town meeting, you were at the front table with a few of us playing goalie for the javelin team, you know, and you heard people say, well, we ought not fund ELL. That way we won't get these kids coming. And I sat there and I remember shaking my head saying, wait a minute, first of all, and don't take this wrong, but I don't need anybody from Beacon Hill or from DC. We don't need anybody to tell us how to take care of Milford kids.
Right.
I mean, Milford citizens have always done what's right by our kids,
Absolutely.
whether it's law or not. But this myth that you could defund ELL special needs, I mean, that's just silly.
Yeah, that's not going to happen, and that's not the way to go. And it's, even if you could, it's counterproductive because, you know, those programs are reimbursed by the state, and ELL, I think, is the highest classification reimbursement. The other bill that the House passed, which is on to the Senate now, expands, or I should say changes the way ELL education would be going forward. So right now, there's the English immersion, which supposedly any child that comes in ELL, they have to be in English immersion within 1 year and learn things for all in English. And it has not worked very well at all. The dropout rate for ELL, I think, is 3 or maybe even higher than that, 3 to 4 times higher than regular students. So the bill that the House passed, it's currently before the Senate, basically kind of changes it around. So instead of the state telling the schools, we want you to teach these children
This way.
We're looking for the local school districts to come up and say, hey, you know, the complexion of our district is such that we believe these programs would be most useful in terms of teaching our ELL students. And state, we want you to approve that. So it's looking for the bottom-up instead of the top-down approach in terms of ELL education. So both myself and Senator Fatman went before the Milford School Committee about a month or so ago and briefed them on that bill. And again, that's pending in the Senate right now. So I think that would be very helpful, and it's definitely a nod to local control, local impact, and being a former school committee member, I could see the value in that, and I know the administration and the staff that we have in our Milford school system, you know, I think they would eat that up and just really, you know, get very, very creative and come up with some great programming.
Well, I mean, if I've got to trust somebody, I'd rather trust somebody that we elected that's basically lived in Milford, that understands Milford. I mean, you were a selectman. You came from the school committee. It seems like that's a breeding ground or a training ground. You know, it seems like, okay, if you want to be selectman, you, Bill, Mike. I mean, I keep going back saying, what a great way to understand. First of all, it's 60% of our budget.
Yep.
It's 90% of our worry is our kids. So before you go off and run the town, you're getting good experience in how do we take care of our kids.
Sure, sure.
You know, and you know, you look at people like you with your 3, you know, and the pride you took or take in your family, and what you wouldn't do to make sure they got everything. You know, all the way down a little freckle nose from, you know, MPAC those days.
Right, right.
And you say, okay, nothing against somebody from Western Mass or from Lowell, Lynn, Agawam, but they don't know Milford.
No, not at all.
They have their own special needs.
Correct.
So if I got to trust somebody, first of all, every 3 years I get to decide whether I like you.
Absolutely.
Right? I really don't get much of a say in the representatives you're working with.
Right.
You know? So it makes me feel much better to put local control in place because they know Milford.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's nice to see, you know, this kind of a trend, this kind of reversal in thinking. You know, it's not only in this, there are other bills that I see popping around. And you know, through the administration and Department of Ed, you're seeing, hopefully, I think, kind of a change because it's just gotten too much, I don't know, heavy at the top. I don't know how to describe it. It just seems like there's too much stuff coming down. We should be looking to the schools themselves, the folks on the front lines who are dealing with kids every day, really, I think, understand the problems and I think have a tremendous wealth of ideas and information on how to deal with those problems.
Well, I mean, you read about some of the communities or towns, cities in Massachusetts, that the big worry is gang violence in the school.
Sure.
I don't know that we spend a lot of money worrying about gang violence in Milford High. Thank God.
Right. Right.
You know, and when I think about it, way back when, English was a second language to many of us.
Absolutely.
I came out and I had no idea what these kids were speaking when I left my home. I mean, we always spoke Portuguese. The Heights
Yeah,
was
yeah.
pretty heavy Portuguese.
Yeah.
Everybody I dealt with was Portuguese. And you get out and you say, okay, what are they saying and why? You know, but the community adapted and we all learned
Yes.
and,
Yes.
you know,
Yes, and I
got
think
what we
it's
needed.
a recognition that the additional language is really a strength. And, you know, we need to build on that and not kind of, you know, shutter that away and force these kids to, you know, deal with English solely and try to teach them math with English when they've only been here a year and God knows what kind of education background they had
Or if they had any.
before they came here. And, you know, no two students are alike, you know. You shouldn't be teaching a 5-year-old, you know, from Ecuador the same way as a 13-year-old from China. But, you know, that ELL program doesn't necessarily draw those distinctions. So, you know, so I think this bill makes sense on a lot of levels.
Well, you know, you think about it, today's global economy, there
Yes.
is an advantage. I remember when we first moved to Paris, and Sharon, my darling bride, went into this French immersion.
Yep.
And it was so frustrating for her because she would say, table, why is that feminine? And it's like, or pen, why is a pen feminine? I don't know, it just is.
Yeah.
Because from Portuguese,
Yeah.
I just thought, well, it's always been feminine.
Okay.
So it made it that much easier to pick up French for me.
Okay.
You know, and even when we picked up Russian afterwards and
Yeah.
started to learn Arabic, which was the challenge of my life.
Sure. Yeah.
But once you already had another language,
Yeah.
it made it that much easier, but it also put us in a competitive advantage. Because if you're going up against somebody for a job and they know English, and you can talk in 2 or 3 different languages, you know, it's just that much better for the kids.
It's a very valuable asset. Very valuable.
So, you know, what you said is profound, that having multiple languages is a benefit to us.
Absolutely.
And then the question is, okay, how do we afford to do it? How do we best do it? And I'm all for what you just said. It should be done at a local level.
I think so. I think so. So, you know, I didn't have any qualms supporting that bill in any way, shape, or form. And again, like getting back to the school committee, I think that background with the school committee was helpful for me to really digest it, because I could just envision, you know, our administration and staff getting really creative and really dealing with things that they're seeing on the ground level.
Well, I mean, think about your years as selectman. How many towns, cities can say they've had a surplus?
Oh, absolutely.
You know, and it's kind of almost a comedy when you try and explain to somebody that the biggest fights we have is how much do we give back? You know, our surplus. How big is the surplus?
I testified, I think it was last week or the week before, I can't even remember, on the Joint Committee on Municipalities, of which I'm a member, for one of the special legislation bills to appoint temporary water commissioners, should the town go forward to decide to purchase the water company. And, you know, I thought it was kind of just a run-of-the-mill bill and, you know, just in and out and just, you know, lay it down. But, you know, the committee actually asked a lot of questions about the purchase, the price, how the town was going to do it. And as I explained to them, they were just so impressed that this town was in the position to even have those kinds of discussions, to be able to make that kind of a change if the town decides to do that. You know, so you had reps there from, oh gosh, you know, I'm just trying to think of Senator from Millbury, Worcester, Fitchburg, and 3 or 4 others. And they were just asking me all of these questions about Milford. How can Milford do that? I said, well, so that was kind of a little bit of an eye-opener for me.
Well, even Woodland School.
Yes.
You know, for how many years you were taking the heat, we were taking the heat, saying, why are you building up stabilization? And there's a school coming.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, $30 million we get to borrow, and we didn't have to use profanity. No 2.5 override,
Right.
no debt exclusion.
It's amazing. It's amazing when you think about it. And it's you know, something that, you know, I think, you know, if rightly or wrong, I think folks around here take a little bit for granted, but it's not like that in other towns. It really isn't.
And that's the hard part. I remember when we were having the debate about how much money we were going to put into library expansion,
Yep.
and towns around us were talking about losing accreditation because they had to cut back on the library.
Yes. Closing libraries.
You know, I mean, look
Yeah.
at one of the projects that you pushed hard was the youth center.
Yes. Yep.
Right. When we were kids, if you ever said you were going to spend $5 million on a youth center, seriously. You know, I joke and say $5 million you could have bought Milford, they'd throw in Hopedale. Never mind one building.
Right. Right.
You know, but it's really a tribute to the residents, because that's where our department heads mainly come from,
Yes.
that they understand and they really care.
Yes.
I mean, we're going to have a fundamental question coming up about the Pheno Field pool.
Yes.
You know, that's a part of Milford.
It really is. It's very important to a large segment of the community that, you know, stays here all the time. And I'm sure you remember, I know I do, I used to take my, you know, banana seat bike and, you know, roll down the hill and go behind sty lawns and
Oh, God.
touch all the colored water, which
And get
I don't
the
know
turtles.
what's going to grow on me.
Well, I was going to say, yes, we didn't know about cadmium and all those pretty...
You know, and all the colored water came out, and we picked up a few pieces of tile, then you go over to the pool there and just kind of hang out, and it was great, you know, it was
But
just
we're
a
going to
great
have
thing
a
to do.
fundamental question on part of Milford.
Yeah,
Because, yes, we have the... And we've had this debate for years. Logically, I could not argue that Casey Pool was not the place we should invest our money, because we didn't have to pay anything. It's free. State does it. But Pheno Pool is Milford. Kind of reminds me of the days when Stacy,
yep,
and you sat there and said, we would have been so much better off financially knocking it down and putting up an ugly glass
oh,
square. We would have saved a lot of money. But it's not Milford.
right,
You know, so I don't know how you feel about the Pheno Pool, but that's going to be, gut feel, $2-3 million. And the people are going to have to decide, do they have an appetite for saving a big historical piece of Milford?
yeah. So that's the cost to what, refurbish, repair the
Well, you know, we
entire-
had budgeted a couple, like 300,000,
Yep,
but we don't know the real numbers yet.
yep,
But the initial numbers came in at $2 to $3 million to redo the whole place. $3 million is a ridiculous number. Of course it was. The youth center at $5 million. The football stadium and complex at $4 million. But can you imagine not having those? You know,
Yeah.
those will be, you know, when we grew up, you remember you were a man when you could swim across the deep end to the piers. You know?
Yeah.
And I always got laughed at because I
Yeah.
said, how many of us remember getting our first kiss behind the field in the tunnel? You know, as silly as it sounds.
Yeah, it's a big part of Milford.
And when we
You
had
know?
little kids, Pheno Field had trees.
Yes,
Casey doesn't.
yes,
Pheno Field started with 6 inches of water that you could take,
right.
you know,
Right.
your daughter down
It
there.
just wade right in. It's very nice.
You know,
Yeah.
and you sit there and say
Yeah.
there's a lot of people in Milford that for that dollar, you know, can go down there for $2 or $3, have a picnic basket.
Absolutely.
So, you know, things like that, I think, are part of Milford, and the town has to decide.
Absolutely.
You know, just like we decided on Stacy,
Yep.
just like we decided on the Armory. You know, those were part of Milford.
Yes.
You know, the football field was redoing a field,
Yes.
but there wasn't any Milford granite, there wasn't huge history there.
No, no, no. It's just
But doing away with Stacy, certainly, I mean, can you imagine anybody wanting a glass, ugly building there instead?
yeah, you know, particularly when you consider the history. I mean, you know, structures had been there since 1901. So, you know, you have 4 separate buildings from a span of, 1901 till about 1995. So that's a very unique educational enterprise. And I mean, you know, that stone that'll be there long after you and I and our children and our grandchildren and children after that. I mean, those structures will be there.
So that's going to be an interesting debate coming up.
Sure.
Because, you know, from a financial point of view, it sounds terrible coming from somebody on the FinCom. You can't justify it financially. You know, what I've said over the years is, I think certain things you do from a little bit of an emotion, from a pride in the town. You know, that, okay, so we got to go forward and invest a little bit. That's why we scrimp and have a surplus every year.
Well, I mean, you know, when you look at it in the sense that, you know, taxpayers contribute to the town, and it's difficult for people to really realize a tangible benefit, you know, unless they, God forbid, have to call the police or the fire department. You know, not often do they realize that tangible benefit of their tax dollars. Something like the youth center, something like Pheno Field provides a real tangible benefit to a lot of people who live in town and pay taxes.
Well, even, you know, when Reno first started talking about
The bike trail again.
the bike trail,
Absolutely. Another great example.
did anybody really believe that trail would have the impact it has? I think everybody thought it would be nice, but my God, you go down there at any hour of the day now,
And when you get out on that trail, when you get into the woods, it's like you're not even in Milford. You're off in some mountainous, you know, country. I mean, it's just absolutely beautiful. There are some really beautiful parts to this town that trail has opened up. And that's really changed the whole complexion of the town.
well, you know, it's funny because I heard the criticism of, well, the towns around us were supposed to do their end,
Yes,
and they never
That's
did,
true.
and we just did ours.
that's true.
And it's like, okay, well, frankly, Charlotte,
Yeah.
I care about Milford.
Absolutely.
And if all we have is 6 miles,
You've got 6 miles.
well, that's more than this old man can walk, so.
That's right. You know, I think it's testament to again, the dedication in Milford. You know, the financial resources, although that was funded largely through the federal and state government. But, you know, for Reno and folks, and I was part of that committee from day one, you know, that was a very tenacious job. Tenacious, just dealing with National Grid alone
Oh, God.
to get access on that right of way. I mean, I was in Jerry Moody's office a couple of times when he had that phone call, and the phone calls with National Grid was like something out of the Twilight Zone. I mean, you just couldn't talk to these people.
Well, I
you
remember
know?
when Reno came and said, you got to trust me with 50 grand because we may need it. If we have to go fight this, it could be 50 grand.
Right,
And then he came back so proud saying, we don't have to spend any of it.
right, yeah,
But that was just a testament to how much work you all did
yes.
to get over the bureaucracy.
It was difficult. That was one of the bigger stumbling blocks that I remember. I think it held it up a year, maybe 2 years, just that issue alone. Yeah, no, that's the kind of amenity that, you know, really makes Milford, I think, a special kind of community.
New question coming up, pot shops in Milford.
Okay, yeah,
I'm trying to figure out, because I was asked before the show what my opinion is. And I said, frankly, I don't know yet. I don't know enough to have an informed opinion. Marijuana's legal. Even though Milford's the center of the universe, we can't go against the state. So it is legal,
That's
end
right.
of story.
right.
The question is there any benefit to having a store in Milford?
Well, the bill that, you know, recently, you know, came from the House and the Senate, which I think the governor just signed, basically increased the financial benefit, not only to the state, but also to local communities. So the ballot question allowed local communities to receive 2% tax. The law that the governor signed, local communities get 3% and also have the option to enter into
So we can double it.
a host agreement up to another 3%. So there's a potentiality for towns to receive 6% of the gross sales revenue from these businesses. In addition, the new law establishes a fund which is going to be administered, I think, through the Cannabis Control Commission, which allows, it seems as though, I would think, you know, grant opportunities or might be just mandatory provisions, you know, for things like, you know, substance abuse prevention, education, enforcement, a whole host of areas that the state money coming in would be allowed to use too. So I think there's going to be some local benefit on that as well. So there are some financial implications that the town needs to understand.
Now, from that end, I see a benefit. I don't know how much 6%, because I don't know
Right.
what the number is.
Right, and I don't think anyone does.
Yeah.
I mean, you can compare it, you can look to see what's going on in these other states, but I don't think anyone really knows how much marijuana is going to be sold.
Right. I mean, you take a Colorado town of 28,000 and you say, okay, they got a pot shop. What kind of revenue are they generating?
Right.
When I started reading, the part that got me a little nervous was that none of the big banks will touch it.
Right.
So
The federal banks.
federal banks, because
Right.
they're worried that the feds are going to nail them for crossing state lines with funds.
Absolutely, yes.
So all of a sudden you end up hearing about Brinks trucks rolling in and out at different times of the day, because obviously if you have all this money sitting in a small building or a large building, just in a location,
Sure.
there are bad people who would like to take that money. So I worry about the security.
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be a possibility. You know that, when we went through the medicinal marijuana facility, they worked very closely with the police chief and the department to ensure, top security. And, at the point that I left the board, I think everyone was real comfortable with the level of security. Things are going to change now, where you're going to have these retail stores. But there's a lot of cash businesses in town. There's, you've got liquor stores, you've got convenience stores. Banks themselves move funds with armored cars. So I mean, I think that happens already. But I think it's incumbent upon the Board of Selectmen to work with the police chief and really help inform the voters. Try to formulate what some of these concerns might be, really flesh those out. Is that a realistic concern? Is it something that's possible?
But see, that makes me feel better if you go to the 3 selectmen and say, in my mind, your responsibility is not to make a decision for me. Give me the data, pro and
Absolutely.
con,
Yep.
and trust that, as we always have in Milford residents, that somehow town meeting will make the right decision. Because I just don't know.
Well, the question now would be on a townwide vote, because the way the new law is set up, if your town voted in the affirmative in the last election to allow marijuana businesses in, then you've got to have a townwide vote to try to prohibit that. So that would be the townwide vote. But similar to the casino issue, I thought that my job as a selectman was to let everyone make as an informed decision as possible. So the idea was to get as much information out there, pro-casino, anti-casino, whatever it is, whatever the effects are, and then you decide. And I think that, that's kind of the same thing that's going on right now, and I'm sure that this board is going to embrace that. I know they've done a lot of work towards that end, and I think their responsibility, which they recognize, and I think going forward, is to try to get as much information out to the general public as they can so that folks can make an informed vote.
See, and that was on the casino. The fundamental issue, I think, that sunk it was they could not answer, why do I need a casino or why do I want a casino in Milford? Certain parts of the state, you look at Fall River, New Beige, that area.
Yes.
If people in Milford could not feed their families,
Yes.
if they had issues, boy, my mind might have changed very quickly about how I felt.
Yes.
But when you sat there and said, when David Nunes came on, I asked him, I said, why? He goes, well, make Milford better. I said, okay, explain better. There's a lot of us who really like Milford.
Right.
Is it
Right.
perfect? No.
Right.
Will it ever be perfect? No. But I moved back because the gravitational pull of raising my family.
Sure.
You've been here.
Yeah.
You're, not the first generation Murray
Right.
in Milford.
Right. Yeah.
I joke with my daughter that she's finally a true Milfordian. 3rd generation Milford, and she lives within 2 miles of her mother.
That's it. That's
the
it.
same thing with, with the pot.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think if we didn't have one, will we survive? Yes. If we do have pot shops, will we survive? Yes. Now give me the pros and cons.
Yeah, I don't think that Milford obviously is under the same economic pressure that, say Everett is, or Springfield, cities that voted overwhelmingly in favor of the casino. And I think you're probably right. There wasn't that driving need for revenue, which was I think the main attraction that the casino had. But, as you know, there were a lot of different issues with that in terms of the traffic environment, and I think that we did as good a job as we could to try to get that information out to folks so that they could realize what those impacts
And at the
might
end,
have been.
I think a lot of people, like me, just said, you're going to change Milford. You can say it for the better, you can say it for the worse, but you're fundamentally going to alter the town I love.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, is there a big enough benefit for me to support changing the nature, the culture? And I don't think the pot is that, because somebody asked me saying, well, wait a minute, you have alcohol, you have packies that, establishments that sell alcohol.
Yes, yeah,
Why is that different than establishments that sell pot?
yeah,
I can't give them a straight answer.
right.
So it'll be interesting to find what's going on.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know if there's been any further public forums, but I think those are helpful. And I really think that, it's incumbent upon our leaders to get that information out to the people so they can have an informed vote.
In the last budget, a question came up about the paradigm that Milford's been operating under. And you were under it for decades, which candidly, in my mind, seems to be, we want an affordable town with good services. And some people have brought up the question, well, why don't we raise taxes so that the school can have more revenue, can be expanded? We're calling for a forum in, I think, October. We were going to do it in September, but because of the forums already.
Okay.
Question, is that the paradigm that Milford works under? And should it be?
I never found the school budget to be underfunded. Now, obviously, the schools, like any other department, I think, have needs and want to try to improve, and that's fine. That's what departments ought to do. But there are some towns that have serious problems with educational funding, and I don't think Milford is one of them. So, you're right. You have to strike that happy balance where you're providing reasonable services at a reasonable price, because there are folks in town where real estate taxes are a real issue. Now, Milford remains a very affordable town. I think that the last thing I saw out of the 35 surrounding communities, we've got the 27th lowest, average tax bill. So, Milford is a very, very affordable town. It's difficult to try to change that without negatively impacting a lot of citizens.
Well, I've got a problem when I think of the people who built Milford. I know you've heard me say it. Some of them are living on $1,500 a month.
Absolutely.
So $100 here, $100 there can make a huge impact.
Absolutely. And housing costs right now, one of the biggest problems that I'm seeing, requests that I get from folks, is to try to find affordable housing. Whether it's a young mother with 3 children, whether it's an elderly couple, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, for these folks to find affordable housing.
Well, if you're living on Social Security, $1,500, $1,300 a month, and the average little apartment in Milford is at least $1,000 or so.
Oh, it's higher than that.
Well,
yeah.
That leaves you $50 a week to survive.
Yeah, where do you go? So you've got to look, for assistance, from the state or the federal government, which, the federal assistance is in question. So it's a real problem out there. But, I don't, and I don't think anybody that I was ever associated with in all the years of town government just sits down and says, hey, we're going to raise taxes. First you've got to identify what the need is. Is there really a need? And then, of course, weigh that need. And I never got the sense that the school budget was drastically underfunded. Now, again, maybe like the police or the fire, they didn't have everything they wanted every year, but you work on a plan.
They never will.
You work on a plan going forward and try to address those concerns year in and year out.
And that's why we're calling for this forum in October, is to say, okay, the paradigm has been this. And I think we're meeting it. Because when you look at the average tax bill in Milford, I mean, thank God the selectmen have this dual tax rate in.
Yes.
Because otherwise, it wouldn't be $4,500 or $4,900 average house.
It's been very helpful.
But now you turn around and say, okay, it's a legitimate question from some of the school committee members. Why don't you ask the voters if they'd be willing to pay more? Because reallocating isn't going to work. You know, Tom O'Loughlin's police budget's what, 94% people?
Sure, yeah, I think, well, most of the budgets are 80, 90%
Right.
per personnel, you know, sure.
So you can't go
yeah,
taking 5-10% off somebody's budget and not
Yeah.
think it's going to cause layoffs.
Yeah.
So
Again, I think it boils down to an identification of need. And how bad is that need, and is the town not meeting that need? I never got the sense that that was really a burning issue, as it is in some other towns. Take a look at Uxbridge, Northbridge. I mean, they've got some real problems with education. That would be a legitimate question in those communities. You know, I don't think you have that in Milford.
Well, we're starting already because, you know, people are saying, well, now you got Woodland done. Why do you want to keep increasing? Because come fall, we'll ask for more money in stabilization. And my answer was, there's a school coming, just like it was for the last 13 years. It's like, what school? High school.
Well, you know, yeah, I mean, and there's some renovation work that's been done to the high school, but, you know, that's coming up, that's 1973 building, so
Right.
figure it out.
So you figure somewhere along the line,
Something's got to be done, sure.
we're going to have $50-60 million worth of renovation into that building. And if we start saving now,
Yep.
so 8-10 years from now, when the state kicks in their half, we'll have a building that we can be as proud of as we did in '73 when we first moved in.
That's right, sure. Yeah, and it's all, you know, and being on the FinCom, you've been right on the front of that. It's a question of balance, and it's a question of trying to address current needs, but also with an eye to what's down the road as well. And it's a very delicate balancing act.
We take a side note. Your view on what the heck's going on in Washington? I am totally confused.
Now, which way? Are you talking about the administration? Because I can't even keep straight of who's working there or who the press
Well,
secretary
it depends on
is
what
or
day it
whatever.
is.
You know,
It depends on what day it is, because it seems to change every other day.
It's just gotten worse, if that's possible, I think, every year in and year out. I mean, the Congress, the Senate is obviously so polarized. They're incapable of doing any kind of business. I think the administration is in total chaos. I don't think that there's a guiding policy going forward. I think it's hurting us internationally in terms of our prestige and our posture and being a leader to influence the world. You just don't have any type of guiding principle. Now, whether you like it or not, you know, looking back to all of the presidents over time, at least you could identify, okay, you know, this president wanted to do that. This president, I don't get this. I don't know what this administration wants to do.
It almost feels like we're going back to the Carter days.
It's a lot of disorganization
And embarrassment.
Yes.
I mean, we can argue
Yes.
whether or not the U.S. could maintain a world leadership role in all aspects. But I don't want to be ostracized either.
No.
There's an
no.
extreme there.
No, to be one of the 3 countries in the world to step out of the Paris Climate Accords was an absolute embarrassment. Absolute embarrassment. One of the freshman reps had filed a bill actually to have Massachusetts maintain the Paris Climate Accords despite the acts of the administration, and I support that. You know, that's where the world is going, and that's an economic driver as well. You know, renewable energy is a great economic driver. We should be out on the forefront of that, and to just step back and not be part of it, along with, I think, Nicaragua and one other country that I can't remember, I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous for the United States of America.
Well, I mean, you start looking, what do you think is going to happen with health care?
Everyone at the state level, including the governor, is extremely concerned, or was extremely concerned. I don't know, I guess they'll revisit it. They always keep say it's over and then they revisit it. But, you know, if they did that American Care Act, which they're looking at, it would be a huge cut to the Massachusetts budget, okay? Not only a number of people would lose health care, federal reimbursement to the state would decrease dramatically, which then impacts our ability to fund other things. So I know the governor was extremely nervous about that passing, and I know that he was very pleased it has not. But it's a very dangerous bill, and the fact that the Republicans can't seem to come to any type of consensus as to what to put together is frightening. It seems as though they're just running things by the seat of their pants.
But now, I worry about both sides, because the Democrats aren't stepping up saying, let's work together, and the Republicans aren't saying, come on over. I keep hearing that in many parts of the country, things like Planned Parenthood, I mean, there's a law you can't use federal funds for abortion. Okay, get that off the table. But defunding it altogether? Well, then who picks up the women's health care in Mississippi and all? I mean, even our own state.
Right.
Didn't our own
Right.
governor, and if you think about Massachusetts, we got pretty good health care around here.
Yep, yep.
He said he'd have to divert funds to make sure that some of the basics were covered by Planned Parenthood.
Absolutely. Planned Parenthood is a huge health provider to many women who you know, can't afford or don't have access to regular health care. So, you know, to talk casually about, you know, defunding that is just an insult to all women, I think.
Well, it's an insult to our intelligence in a lot of cases,
Yes.
because what are you going to do? I mean, I love when you have people who say, Obamacare is terrible, but we're going to do away with Planned Parenthood so that people have to rely on Obamacare. Well, how do you, it's like you're speaking out of two orifices.
Right, right, right.
You know,
right.
something doesn't make sense.
There's no direction. They have no idea what they want to do with it. The major impetus is to try to eliminate that tax on the high earners to fund that Medicaid expansion, and that's really what they're interested in. They're not interested in providing health care to people.
But one way or another, you're going to tax. I mean, at the end of the day, health care is not 1% a year increase.
No, it's awful. It's
Right?
awful.
So until you fix the fundamental issue, you're going to keep eating up more and more of our state money, federal money,
Yes.
for health care.
Yes.
You know, and I keep hearing, okay, they're going to let Obamacare implode. I don't know what that means.
I think what the administration, the Republicans try to do is to make it so untenable for insurance companies, they won't be offering policies to anybody.
Well, they're doing that now.
So, well, I think they want that to continue. Yeah.
Because you start looking and you say, I'm reading more and more, there's one choice.
Yes.
Well, if anything, the American way has said competition is usually the best option to control and give you price benefits.
And you're getting the opposite now.
And now you're getting one person bidding.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, you know, getting back to what, you know, you talked about earlier, it really comes down to people trying to work together to come up with something that makes sense. And there just doesn't seem to be the ability or the desire right now to do that in Washington.
No, let's hope it does change, because everybody holds the Supreme Court nominee as the one triumph the administration's had. And I shake my head and say, shame on both the Republicans and the Democrats, because what's scaring me the most is we got some old justices.
Yes.
And when I heard the Democrats scream that no matter who you propose, we're not going to accept, now all of a sudden I worry that whoever's in power is going to go either extreme right or extreme left,